Well, hello, this is Robert Glasscock, and I want to alert you to a very special program that Thomas and I are doing together on April 20th. This is going to cover the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction on April 20th and 21st, wherever you happen to be in the world. This is really one of the biggest astrological events in the sky this year when Jupiter and Uranus come together in Taurus. And we're going to be deciphering that conjunction for all 12 signs, your sun sign and your rising sign, with news you can use on a practical level. So join us for this big event coming up.
And when is it going to be? April 20th at 4 p.m. Eastern. We'd love to have you there. All the rest of the details and the registration link are at the top of funastrology.com. We'll look forward to seeing you then. Welcome in to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast with Robert Glasscock. I'm Thomas Miller, and Robert is going to answer a great listener question for us, which you can leave if you would like to. We're kind of back in business here. I have moved. I'm settled. The booth is up, and we are taking your questions. You can go to funastrology.com. In the upper left is an orange button. Click it and leave us an anonymous message like Kimberly, our great friend who is in the Air Force, did here.
I know that when planets change sign, there is a lot of activity. So the question is, what about when planets change houses? Is there an uptick in the activity of that house? I'll give an example from my own life. Uranus and Jupiter currently transit my sixth house, but Uranus is actually on its way out in like 2 degrees. And in the last month, I have had surprises in medical things in my body. And in fact, I'm most likely going to have surgery. And I definitely highlighted my health, my routine. I'm having to look at all that over again and go say, what can I do better? Right? Because there's also the great benefic. What can I do better? But I just wondered, like, is that normal? Like, as a planet leaves the house, be prepared for fireworks. And this is, of course, the first time I've even tracked this. So thank you so much. And I've tracked this because of your podcast. So thank you so much. Have a great day. Keep being great. Bye.
Oh, Kimberly, we love you. Thank you so much. And basically, this is an interesting question. Okay, so when a planet enters a new house, now, one thing that comes to mind right off the bat, Robert, is I think we have to separate fast movers from slow movers. And she mentioned a very slow mover. Uranus is almost out of her sixth house. I say boot, scoot, and boogie on its way out. Boom, going out the door. And she's having these health issues as this slow mover theme builder is moving its way out. But then also we could consider the fast movers, the more trigger planets, even the moon. We could come down to that when the moon enters a house. So why don't you just give us a broad spectrum of what to expect when planets change houses versus signs?
Great. And thank you, Kimberly, for your service. Truly.
Yes, amen.
You have to look at the nature of the planet itself. The moon entering and leaving a house, it takes 1 month, slightly under, for the moon to go through all the houses. So the moon operates on a very relatively trivial day-to-day basis. Sometimes the moon will reinforce larger aspects and it won't be so trivial. And the same with Venus and Mercury, for example. You have Venus leaving a house or entering a house that may bring some social activity that involves that house, but it's relatively trivial. The major planets, on the other hand, like Uranus, which is what Kimberly is talking about, it's in the last few degrees of her sixth house. The implication is that a health condition that suddenly emerges during this transit of Uranus through her sixth house of health will be resolved. It's at the end of that house and about to enter her seventh house. It doesn't do it for at least 2 degrees, and Uranus will turn retrograde, so it may move back and forth. That could take as long as a year or 2 even to fully enter her seventh house. But during the year, while it's still in her sixth and going back and forth, is when she is likely to resolve the health issues that have arisen under this. So not to fear it, but to concentrate on resolving them, and not only with traditional medicine. Certainly you listen to your physicians and do what they say, But Uranus is also alternative healing, and so is Neptune. But with Uranus particularly, there can be other supplementary alternative methods of helping Kimberly to heal this condition. And then as Uranus goes into her seventh house, and it will be in that house for 7 years, during which she will completely revolutionize her attitudes and approaches to all significant relationships in her life, personal, certainly, but also professionally. So one of the things she can look forward to, since Uranus, among other things, rules astrology, is using astrology and her understanding of it to perhaps think about some sort of business partnership, some maybe joint or even group venture. And groups may play a significant role in her life over the next 7 years. If she becomes more interested in astrology, for example, she might go to conventions where she not only learns a great deal about astrology, but she makes new friends, contacts new groups, and maybe even finds somebody that she could be romantically interested in. So that's the sort of, if you just think about the nature of the planet, the nature of the house that it's beginning to transit, it simply says, be consciously aware of what this planet symbolizes in relationship to the house that it's transiting. So her significant relationships will tend to completely reverse their status quo. If she is single going into this Uranus transit, she's likely to find a major personal relationship or even a marriage during the transit of Uranus. Or if she's married, the relationship, on the worst case scenario, not necessarily the worst, but she could get divorced. It's changing the status quo. If she's married, her partner may find a whole new career direction in their lives. And so it changes the nature of the relationship. There could be a relationship that forms that involves a move or a relocation. She may be getting out of the Air Force during that transit and so on. So that's the nature of the planet, Uranus, and the house. So you're combining the interpretation both ways.
I think, if I remember right, that Kimberly is happily married. So in that case, when you start to say something, yeah, take that one and go.
All right. Well, very simple. There can be a birth, a baby. I don't know if she already has children. She might. But Uranus is one of the planets of birth. I remember, and I tell clients this many years ago, I read some astrologer, I forget who, took the symbol of Uranus, and he said, look at it. Think of a Chinese woman in a coolie hat squatting in a rice paddy to deliver a baby. And if you think about the visual symbol of Uranus, it's very true. So Uranus, whether it's a literal baby or a figurative baby, it is an aspect of new birth, awakening, the awakener. So Uranus going through the seventh house, if she is married, the marriage itself, you don't have to get divorced. You may sometimes, depending on the aspects that Uranus is making, but it symbolizes the birth of a new status in the marriage itself. She might be retiring from the Air Force during that transit, for example, and the couple, she and her husband, would start a new life. It can mean a relocation or a move, especially if she's leaving the Air Force. Then what is she going to do? So it's the start of a new career vector for her as well. Or she could be extending her Air Force contract and stay in it and rise to a higher level within it, which again would completely change her relationships and for the better. But that's the way to think about these transits. If it's Saturn, it's another way of thought. If it's transiting Neptune, it's another way of thought. If it's Jupiter, it's another way of thought. But you're combining the interpretation of the planet's meanings with the house meanings.
Now, let's distinguish between these slow movers and the fast movers, because you just mentioned 3 slow movers. You mentioned Pluto. Well, we're talking about Uranus here, which has an 84-year orbit. You've got Neptune, which has a 164-year orbit. When it goes into a house like Pluto, now will be moving into different real estate in Aquarius, and that will hit people in different places in their chart. Certainly moving forward, but it's going to take 20 years. So how can you distinguish life, just life happening over 2 full decades, and this major planet that is building new themes into that area of our life?
Well, I have Pluto, for example, in my first house now, and it's just entering Aquarius. It's been in my first house for years. It's going to be in my first house for another 20 years before it enters my second. Now, the last time I had a significant Pluto aspect angular was when it went through my 10th house, and Pluto rules extremes. And when that last one happened, I became a television writer for 15 years, something I wanted to do because I looked at the aspect before it happened. I looked at it coming up, and I thought, what do I want to do with this? And that was what I wanted to do with it. It was, gee, I'd like to write for television. So I took a couple of courses in learning the format for writing for television. I knew I could write, but it's Pluto's very slow moving, and my life has changed during this Pluto transit. I've completely changed my life. I moved for the first time in 20 years. I moved about 4 years ago, and my astrology career also dramatically changed during this Pluto transit. First, by beginning long ago to teach for Kepler College, which has been wonderful. And then my own practice has grown so much that I don't have the time to teach for Kepler like I used to. And I love that. I love to teach more than anything. But I also love to read horoscopes. And so I can see that it's a slow moving transit, but even so, whether it's Pluto, Uranus, Neptune, even Saturn, just be aware of the time it takes for those transits. Saturn takes about 2.5 years in one sign in one house. So for the 2.5 years, Saturn rules the structure of your life. It rules the skeleton in the body, the framework of the organization, the discipline, the hard work, etc., that you have to take. But where it's transiting, pay attention and be willing to do the hard work. It's going through my third house right now. I'm writing 2 books and loaded up with clients and readings and podcasts. So it's all Saturn in my third house right now. And it takes a lot of time, but I love it. So it doesn't feel like working for somebody else at a job I don't particularly like. It's very rewarding work for me. It's all very third house, mental and communication and so on. So if you pay attention to the length of the transits, and in Kimberly's case, it's going to be Uranus for 7 years going through her 7th house. So she's married now. That marriage is going to undergo some wonderful, radical changes, including possibly relocation, possibly having a baby, possibly getting into a new kind of career, a new kind of business, both for her and her partner, because it's the 7th house. It's wonderful. And then you think, what house does Uranus rule in her birth chart, for example? So it's in Taurus right now. I'm assuming that she's got Scorpio rising. So her 4th house would be Aquarius, which is Uranus's sign. So the idea of her relocating and perhaps, I don't know how long she's been in the Air Force, but she could be leaving the Air Force to go back into civilian life. In what capacity, for example? So that's the way to kind of think about these longer term transits.
And
What house do they rule, or house is in the birth chart, and what house are they entering?
for a lot of people, the idea of change is like fingernails down a chalkboard. It's like, we like our stability. We like our certainty. We don't want things to be disrupted, our perfect little world. And yet, that chart just keeps on moving, and the reality is life is full of changes.
That is so true, and particularly for fixed signs like you. Change is difficult because fixed signs like to get things in a groove and keep the groove going. And therefore, the kinds of energies that are required for change tend to build up in fixed signs until they explode. And then they make what seem to be sudden, radical changes in their lives. But in fact, they've been thinking about these changes for a long time, either consciously or unconsciously. A lot of the times it is unconscious, but things will build up to a pressure point, or something sudden will happen in their lives that make them, I should make this change. I can make this change. So they make what seem to be sudden radical changes on the surface, but it turns out those changes have been developing sometimes for many years. I know the change you just made, the move, the relocation, actually goes back to a contact you made years ago
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that suddenly come back into your life.
Mm-hmm.
in wonderful and surprising ways. Very Uranian.
There's another element of this that I think is very important. You and I both believe that we are conscious creators. In other words, there is that part of this astrology where we can look at an aspect and realize if we just did absolutely nothing, maybe it impacts one way, but that through various practices that various people have, we can consciously create our future. And I heard it in your story when you consciously created a future around that Pluto transit. So how do we weave that in here as well? And I'm thinking like for Kimberly, she has this coming up. How can she take that Uranus and consciously create something in that 7th house over the next 7 years?
Well, to me, that's the whole point of astrology. It's not fatalistic. There's certain things that seem to be fatalistic, but every planet and every point and every house in astrology has a positive meaning and a negative meaning. And the whole point of studying astrology is to become consciously aware of those potential meanings. And that conscious awareness gives you choice, as opposed to living a reactive life. People who say, oh, what's going to happen to me? Are you kidding? The question should be, what can I do with this? I have a horrible horoscope. But boy, have I come, thank heaven I got into astrology at 20 when I did, because it brought me up short, because many of the old books that seemed so fatalistic were absolutely right. But they made me look at myself in an honest way for a change, which I had not been doing before. And as I studied it more, I went, this also has this positive meaning. Well, now I can begin to focus on that. I need to eliminate this from my life or from my behavior or personality and focus more on this. So every single point in the horoscope and planet has a positive and negative meaning. And hard aspects also, they do too. Every aspect has a positive side. Personally, I love hard aspects because they connote frustration. And the reason for the frustration is a sort of divine message about, all right, you're frustrated in this area. Do something about it. Solve the frustration. And in the act of doing that, you evolve and you advance and you grow and you become more fulfilled. So hard aspects really are aspects of ambition. So there are different ways to think about it, but astrology in an ideal world gives you the conscious understanding of your own free will and how to make the most and make the best out of what's in your horoscope.
And then I think the other side of that is, as Kimberly indicated in her question, here Uranus is moving through the last couple of degrees of the 6th house, and a very 6th house theme hit her by surprise, an unexpected health issue that might even result in a surgery. So there's that part of, and I know Kimberly's a conscious creator too, that she believes this same thing that we do, and all of a sudden, out of the blue comes something that she just totally didn't expect, and it was, I mean, if she had surgery, obviously pretty disruptive.
Well, there's another way to think about surgery, and that's cutting out something that has been building up that's unhealthy. Otherwise, a physician wouldn't say, we're going to have to perform surgery to get rid of whatever it is that's bothering you. That can be cancer. It can be anything. But the act of surgery is a very drastic action, but it's very clear. It's cutting out something. That's a physical act, the act of undergoing surgery. It's also happening psychologically and emotionally and spiritually at the same time. So if you're aware of it, surgery is tremendously positive. You're cutting out something physically that's damaging or even life-threatening. But it's asking you astrologically and metaphysically, be aware that you're also cutting out something psychologically and spiritually that's been damaging, and you're going to grow as a result of cutting this out. And by being aware of it, your spiritual and psychological growth can be increased exponentially because you're consciously aware of it. You can think about the body part that's being operated on or being cut out, and think about what that sign that rules that body part has to do with your life. And where do you have a buildup of maybe negative beliefs involving that sign in your life? And by cutting out the old diseased or worn out conditions, you're opening up that same sign on a positive level to be incorporated consciously into your life toward greater fulfillment and greater health.
Okay, let's finish with this question, this add-on. What about, she talked about an issue that came up as the transit was completing. In other words, the last part of the transit through that house. Would you just walk us through the difference between one that might hit at the beginning, and we could even use just the decanates, 10 degrees, the first 10 degrees, the middle 10, and the last 10, as far as what we might expect a planet to, how we might expect it to affect us through that house?
Yeah, one of the things I loved about Kimberly's question, and she herself pointed this out, it's Uranus transiting the last, I guess is the last degrees of the house anyway.
Right.
About to enter
last
a new
two,
house.
yeah.
So you read it literally, that the health condition that she's having, potentially having surgery for, is at the end of its own life. If you think about the disease or the illness or the diseased organ as having its own life, surgically removing it ends its life. And that is meant to free her from a condition that has built up over time, free her to go moving forward in a healthier way of life. And you can incorporate the planet and the signs that are involved here. It's Uranus and Taurus, and think about what those means. But you literally read it. It's at the end of the house, and it's at the end of this health matter, not the beginning. If it were beginning and entering this house and she had surgery, then that's something that's she's caught in the bud, nipped in the bud, so to speak. This way it's basically over. And the overness of it is the surgery, removing it, which frees her. Doesn't limit her, it frees her.
Excellent. And what a great positive way to approach change that often can be inevitable. Thanks, Robert. We appreciate that. And if you'd like to talk to Robert, the information of how to contact him is in the show notes, along with everything else that we have going on around here, which is quite a bit. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time on the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast with Robert Glasscock.